Hello, my name's Clive Brown, Finance Manager for Principles Australia Institute. This webcast is a first of a two-part series relating to purchasing within MYOB, the accounting system used by Principles Australia Institute. Firstly, we're going to look at some fundamentals in relation to what we need to know before we do any purchasing and before we have any understanding of MYOB itself, is about the structures and the requirements behind the system. When we talk about structures within accounting, we refer to the chart of accounts. At PAI, we've split that into two separate elements, one being the jobs, which refer to the things that you do, the activities in relation to the project, the other being accounts, income and expenses associated with the things that you do. They describe the nature or the type of costs and incomes of the project. Combining those, we know what the activity has spent its money on. The job structure comprises four elements which enable organisational multi-level project reporting. The first element identifies the project, and in this case, KM refers to Kids Matter. The PAI program is one of four, and that indicates that it's improved outcomes for children and young people. The third element identifies the activity within this project, and here we've used 01 to identify the national team. The last element, the funding source, we've used 63, and that identifies that it's Beyond Blue, who are the funders for Kids Matter. So when we add all that up, we get KM 10163, and we're able to look at these jobs on an organisational level and say, well, okay, how much does Beyond Blue fund across the whole of PAI, and add all the 63s. Or we can say how much is spent or received for improved outcomes for children and young people. And then we would go through all the jobs and click on only those that have a 1 after the first 2 or 3 digits, which are alpha characters. And that way we can use MYOB to add up our expenditures and incomes instead of using complicated spreadsheets. Looking at accounts come in two components, as I mentioned previously, that we'll be primarily using: income and expense. The income accounts have a grouping that starts with a 4. And for example, we have 411,000 grant entitlements, 42,000 service and product income, 42200 sales, and 49,000, that should be, other income generated such as interest and profit on sale of asset. The expense account group starts with a 6, and we can see here that the 61000 is travel, 62000 overhead expenses, 63000 conferences, meetings and attendance, and 64000 wages and staffing. That includes actual wages themselves, superannuation, recruitment, work health and safety, consultants, secondees and contractors. So we're looking at the total cost of all employment within PAI. In a little more detail and looking deeper into those, the accounts that you'll be commonly using have been highlighted here with a red colour, and you'll see that the ones that are left in black will predominantly be a central usage, and these red ones will be the ones you come across. If we look at domestic travel in the 61100 grouping, we can see that that's travel incurred by staff within PAI and within Australia. So what we're looking at really is to identify all the cost of flights using airfares domestic. accommodation, meals, car hire, booking. The explanation assists. Now, if, for example, you come across a train fare or a bus fare and you say, well, we haven't got a code for bus fares. Looking into the explanation, you can see that it says all forms of ground travel. So if there's a bus or a train, then it's reasonable that you would code it to car hire or taxi. They're very rare and there's no need to separate them out any further. International travel is more of a central function, and I would suggest that if you come across that, the first thing you should do is query that the Principles Australia Board have approved it as required by delegations. Overhead expenses, and again I've highlighted in red those you're most likely to come across, and you can see that in the office expenses grouping we've got printing, stationery, newspapers, cleaning and consumables. One thing to note here is that the difference between cleaning and stationery, or office and cleaning as opposed to stationery. The reason being for that is that if you're purchasing from Officeworks, you may be buying the products here from Officeworks that's a stationer, but they're not stationery. So it's important that you do identify and separate those two costs. Finance and legal expenses, they're generally incurred centrally. You more than likely won't come across them too often, but you may want to know what they are if there's a query or something comes up in your drop-down list and should I use that one? Building and equipment, again in red, the ones you'll most commonly use. Minor equipment, minor furniture expenditures, they could be, for example, that you buy a keyboard and a mouse for somebody who's got a laptop that has difficulty using the keyboard and pad on the laptop and need that little bit extra in there to assist them with their work. Repairs and maintenance, again, more often a head office function or a central function, but you may come across it if, for example, in a particular office you needed to get someone in to fix a chair or to maintain some equipment. Communications and IT, things like telephone, teleconference costs are more often than not a central cost. You may occasionally get a teleconference cost. More than likely you'll have postage and freight, so stamps and parcel delivery. So you might be using a courier or through Australia Post. Software and license, I've included that in red, although probably not a common one for anyone outside of the central office. External IT support, again, not necessarily likely outside of the central office, but you may come across it from time to time, as with website and database costs. So depending on where you are, you might be given through your project a requirement to incur some costs within that area, and therefore would be able to look up and say, oh yes, that fits within that description of that item, and there's the account code for it. Memberships and licenses, probably a big no. Awards and initiative payments. In some programs there's school initiative payments. They might get particular funding or sponsorship, and it's to be provided to schools who achieve certain outcomes, and that's how we record the payment or the prize, if you like. It might be a cash donation, it may be the purchase of a plaque or something. Generally though, this would be a monetary payment, and more than likely a central function. Promotion and marketing, here we may have some design and artwork. Otherwise, I would say it would probably be a central function. Publications, again, within a project, more than likely a central function, less likely to be a remote function, but nevertheless you may come across the purchase of non-PAI material, whether it's for internal reference or for resale. Conferences. This one seems to bring the most confusion. So what we're looking at here is if you're going to someone else's conference, right, so it's external to PAI, then more than likely it'll just be the registration, the direct cost of attendance. Any financial support, display and booths and resources provided for it would more than likely be a central function. Facilitation. That means a PAI or a project run event. Could be a meeting, could be a conference, and could be a training seminar. And there we look at the types of expenditures within that, which we capture by with catering, venue hire, guest speakers, training materials, promotional items as distinct from the materials. So the materials are the handouts and manuals. Promotional items are pamphlets, caps, pens, and perhaps even the small USBs that get handed out in perhaps like a show bag situation. Insurance, generally PAI's insurance would cover most events that we run, although sometimes it's important to check that we have sufficient coverage for the event that's being run. Materials, and there we talk about visual aids and presentation items that are purchased in addition to. Wages and on-costs, not something that you would charge things to. These costs here and here are generated by the payroll system and should not include any purchase order transactions. Other staff costs, you may come across the staff amenities and uniforms, not necessarily uniforms, but certainly the tea, coffee, sugar and milk. An occasion such as a morning tea supply. So I would like to separate the morning tea from the meetings if it's not specifically for a meeting. Training and professional development, approved training by an external provider or specific in-house training. So there might be a cost associated within the project that is paid to an outside body or within PAI. Health and safety, normally this would be an central charge and it comes through HR. Recruitment, advertising and agencies to recruit staff, and that again is another central function. The consultants and contractors, rarely but occasionally you may be asked to identify expenses against these codes. And often confusion occurs between what is a consultant and what is a contractor. And quite simply, we're looking at a consultant being that specialist service to review, investigate or advise PAI. And it's not legal or marketing practice. It's more about investigating something that's being done to see if it's being done in the best form or we're using it to our best capability, or we're getting that specialist service. Consultants generally do not work within the PAI premises, and they have a brief, they go away, they write their report after their investigations and submit that before payment. Contractors, outworker and freelance. Generally what they do is they undertake work in lieu of PAI staff. They're outsourced. So they're not actually staff, but they're doing similar work to what staff might do. And again, they're independent, so they're not employed as a staff member, but they're doing that sort of work. Agency staff, by contrast to a contractor, they are replacing or supporting existing staff. And so, in effect, they are an employee in many regards, and they're filling a gap within our structure. Secondments, labour from another organisation, business or body that remains an employee of that body. So if someone's on secondment, they're not required to be part of our staffing costs for wages and salaries. All that's taken care of by their employer, and we pay their employer for that benefit that we have of having them on our or in our projects. When it comes to purchasing, where does it all start? It starts with an intention to purchase. There's something you want, something he needs. Perhaps it's something she requires, or it's just something we've run out of. The first thing to do is to complete a purchase order request form, what we refer to commonly as a PORF. This is needed for all purchases, including but not limited to airfares, accommodation, car hire, venue hire, catering, stationery and subscriptions. Those things that you don't need purchase orders for will have a contract, which is in effect a different form of purchase order because contracts get signed by approved delegates, and so that is the authority to undertake that expenditure. Speaking of authorities, we're talking about approvals, which are also referred to as delegations. Delegation is the passing on of certain information from one certain responsibilities from a senior person to a subordinate that gives that subordinate authority to act. At PAI, this is achieved by the board approving a schedule of delegations. Delegations are limited not only by the amount or the total dollars that they might approve, but also by their area of responsibility, their project, and that budget within the project. So fundamentally, if you're asked to approve something for another project, then technically the answer is no. There may be occasions where that is required for convenience or to complete a process, in which case that person should identify that they're signing on behalf of someone else. Similarly, if they don't have a budget for that item of expenditure, that nature of expense, that type of expense, then they shouldn't be approving it. The purchase order request form needs to be authorised by your manager or recommended by the manager to or for a higher authority approval before it's entered into MYOB as a purchase order. How are approvals given? They must be in writing to be valid, and that may be a manual signature on the purchase order request form, an email approval with the request attached. So you might send an email to, for example, Jeremy, and say, Jeremy, I've got a purchase order here that's been requested by one of the project officers for travel. Would you please approve it? Jeremy emails back, yes, I've looked at that, approved. A letter of memorandum may also be an approval, where somebody writes and says that I understand ABC is happening and this will incur expenditure. You are authorised to purchase up to $100 worth of equipment, item X, stationery, whatever it might be. And another form of approval is the contract or agreement, where two parties generally have signed a contract to the supply of a service or a good, and the PAI signature is that approval then for expenditure to take place. It may not necessarily generate a purchase order, but it certainly is a form of approval. That ends session 1. You will get a copy of the delegations in process, and you should be aware that these are available on the PAI server under administration, and whenever in doubt you should check that your copy is current and that the delegations are being followed. Until we get to MyOb Purchasing, I thank you for your attendance.